Templars, 5 secret strategies that crushed much larger armies. In an age when kingdoms collapsed under the weight of their own fear, the Templars rose like an unstoppable force, shaped by discipline, silence, and purpose. Imagine armies moving with chaotic rhythms, banners trembling in the wind, generals confident in their overwhelming numbers until the horizon shifted, and a small formation of white mantles advanced without hesitation. No shouting, no chaos, only a cold, calculated presence that made entire battalions reconsider their certainty. That moment, when courage sinks into the enemy's stomach, was the true beginning of every Templar victory. It wasn't the sword that terrified their opponents, it was the mastery of the mind. Picture the battlefield, moments before the clash. Thousands of warriors beating their shields, screaming war cries, raising dust into the morning sun. And yet, in the midst of this storm, the Templars remained motionless, as if anchored to an invisible order no one else could comprehend. Their discipline was not natural, it was engineered through years of training that eliminated hesitation, erased fear, and transformed instinct into precision. Enemies often described the sensation of facing them as standing before a living wall, cold and calculated, as if they were fighting something more than men. This psychological blow struck long before the first blade touched flesh, shifting the balance of war in their favor before a single strike was made. And then, when the moment finally arrived, when the dust settled, enough foreshadows to take shape, the Templars moved like one unstoppable organism. Their timing was surgical, their silence suffocating, and their formations impossible for even the greatest armies of the era to break. What happened next wasn't chance, wasn't miracle, wasn't legend. It was strategy. Hidden, forbidden, meticulously crafted strategy. The kind medieval kings feared, chroniclers whispered about, and enemies never survived long enough to understand. Today, you will step into the heart of those secrets, the 5 invisible mechanisms that allowed a small brotherhood to crush armies far larger and far stronger than themselves. Prepare to witness what transformed the Templars from warriors into a phenomenon. The rise of the Templars was never about the size of their armies, but about the precision of their minds. While medieval kingdoms expanded through sheer force, the Templars expanded through design, a silent architecture of discipline, loyalty, and unwavering purpose that turned even their smallest battalions into engines of dominance. Before steel clashed or hooves thundered, their victories were already unfolding in the psychology of those who dared to face them. Armies accustomed to chaos found themselves paralyzed when confronted with an order so absolute that it seemed almost otherworldly. This introduction pulls you directly into the heartbeat of that world, where strategy towered above numbers and perception became a battlefield of its own. They did not march like other warriors. They advanced with the cold calculation of men who believed every breath had meaning, every step carried intention, and every silence was a message. An enemy soldier witnessing them emerge over a ridge would feel an unsettling stillness spreading through his chest, not because the Templars were many, but because they looked unbreakable. Chroniclers from across continents noted the same impression. The Templars moved as if guided by an invisible force that rendered hesitation impossible. That unity, that iron discipline, was crafted long before they ever set foot on the battlefield. Forged inside a culture where loyalty was oxygen and fear was weakness, to be extinguished at the root. Across deserts, forests, and stone fortresses, their reputation traveled faster than their footsteps. Kingdoms whispered about the brotherhood that defeated armies 3, 4, even 5 times their size. Rumors grew into fear, and fear became a weapon they never had to lift a finger to sharpen. Enemy scouts sent to observe returned emotionally shaken, claiming they had witnessed soldiers who did not seem to tire, falter, or scatter under pressure. And while myths inflated their image, the truth was far more formidable. The Templars were masters of engineering the psychological collapse of their opponents long before the first sword was drawn. Each mission was crafted with meticulous awareness of human behavior. They understood how uncertainty corrodes the mind, how silence increases tension, and how perfect formation can turn a group of men into a myth before the battle even begins. Commanders who faced them for the first time often underestimated them, believing numbers alone would guarantee victory. But numbers meant nothing against an army that fought as if the world depended on every gesture. Their strategies were not random bursts of brilliance, they were foundational systems designed to break logic, disrupt rhythm, and trigger panic. Even their armor and symbols played a role in shaping perception. The white mantles marked with the red cross were more than insignia. They were psychological architecture. The sight of an army in coordinated white ranks, advancing without hesitation, created an image of purity fused with unstoppable force. In a time where symbols carried the power of stories, the Templars mastered the ability to let their presence speak louder than their weapons. They understood that war is not fought only with steel, it is fought with ideas that shape how the enemy breathes, thinks, and reacts. As you enter this journey into the core of their hidden strategies, you step into a world where discipline was sharper than blades and silence was deadlier than arrows. The Templars were not merely warriors, they were architects of pressure, chaos, and psychological dominance. And what you are about to uncover are the 5 mechanisms that truly explain how a brotherhood so small defeated armies so large. Prepare to cross into the unseen layer of medieval warfare, where victory was forged long before the first strike. On every battlefield of the Middle Ages, noise was a declaration of power. Armies roared, commanders shouted, cavalry thundered. Chaos was the language of war until the Templars appeared. Their first secret strategy was the mastery of silence, a technique so unsettling that even veteran soldiers felt their confidence crack before the clash began. While other forces used intimidation through volume, the Templars weaponized the absence of it. Their advance was so quiet that enemy battalions often mistook the approaching formation for a vision, not an army. This silence wasn't born of accident. It was trained, rehearsed, and embedded into their identity. They understood that fear thrives in the unknown, and silence magnifies the unknown into something overwhelming. At the moment when most armies relied on shouting to boost morale, the Templars relied on discipline so absolute that not a single voice rose unless commanded. Their movements were synchronized through subtle signals, controlled breathing, and instinct built through relentless drill. To the enemy, it felt as if they were watching a living wall glide across the earth, steady and merciless, with no tremor of doubt. That unnatural cohesion forced opposing forces to question everything: their own formation, their own courage, their own chances of survival. Silence, in this context, didn't weaken the Templars. It surrounded them with an aura of inevitability, a message whispered directly into the nerves of their enemies. You cannot break what does not fear you. Records from Muslim chroniclers and European observers alike mention the same phenomenon before the Templars even struck. Fear had already begun its work. Commanders noticed soldiers tightening grips on their weapons, shifting uneasily, or losing formation as the silent white Andred phalanx drew near. The first cracks in morale happened before steel met steel, long before the first cry of pain. And when the Templars finally broke that silence with their first coordinated shout, it hit like a thunderclap. The contrast between the suffocating, quiet, and the explosive battle cry shattered enemy confidence, creating a shockwave through their ranks. This was not improvisation, but psychological engineering, and it set the foundation for victories that defied numbers. The second strategy that gave the Templars an overwhelming advantage on the battlefield was their mastery of the U-formation collapse, a maneuver so precise, so perfectly timed, that it turned enemy charges into self-destruction. Unlike the chaotic lines of medieval armies, which relied on brute force and scattered momentum, the Templars crafted a formation that manipulated movement, psychology, and geometry all at once. At a distance, the U-formation appeared weak at the center, intentionally inviting the enemy to attack what looked like the most vulnerable point. This illusion was the first layer of the trap. The enemy believed they could break through quickly, unaware that the opening was designed to lure them into a deadly funnel. What seemed like an easy victory was actually the doorway into their defeat. As the opposing cavalry or infantry advanced, the Templar center executed a calculated micro-retreat only a few steps back, barely perceptible, but enough to intensify the illusion that they were being pushed. This subtle movement inflamed the confidence of enemy commanders, who mistook it for panic. They ordered their troops to press harder, faster, believing they had found the flaw that would shatter the formidable Templar line. What they did not realize was that every inch of ground they gained was a step deeper into the jaws of the formation. The sides of the U remained firm, unmoving, watching, waiting. The Templars were not reacting, they were orchestrating, and the enemy was marching willingly into the heart of their design. When the enemy finally entered the curve of the formation, the trap sprang to life. The two flanks of the U, which had remained perfectly still until that moment, surged inward simultaneously like a pair of steel gates slamming shut. Soldiers who had moments earlier felt victorious suddenly found themselves trapped in a tightening corridor with no maneuverability. Panic erupted in the compressed space as cavalry struggled to turn their horses, and infantry clashed against their own advancing ranks. The Templars, meanwhile, exploited the chaos with ruthless efficiency, striking from angles the enemy had no way to defend. What was moments earlier a confident charge had now become a suffocating disaster. The brilliance of the U-formation did not come solely from its shape but from the discipline required to execute it. Every Templar knight and sergeant had to hold position with unwavering calm, resisting the instinct to collapse prematurely or attack too soon. The center had to retreat at the exact pace needed to maintain the illusion without collapsing the structure. The flanks needed to close with precision, neither too early nor too late. A single moment of hesitation, a single mind breaking away from the rhythm, could ruin the entire strategy. But the Templars were not ordinary soldiers. Their training suppressed individual impulse and replaced it with collective focus. They functioned as one mind spread across dozens of bahtis. Chroniclers from the period recorded battles where entire divisions of skilled cavalry were neutralized. Within minutes, by this maneuver, the enemy, trapped and disoriented, was overwhelmed by coordinated Templar strikes delivered with mathematical precision. Historians later noted that the psychological collapse was often more devastating than the physical losses. Commanders who survived these engagements reported feeling humiliated and mentally broken, unable to understand how their superior numbers had crumbled so quickly. The myth of Templar invincibility spread rapidly after each of these encounters, further amplifying the effectiveness of the maneuver as fear worked alongside formation. At its core, the U-formation collapse was more than a battlefield tactic, it was a message encoded into movement. It told every enemy who dared to charge, your strength means nothing if you cannot read the mind of your opponent. The Templars didn't simply defeat armies, they manipulated them. They shaped their decisions, guided their mistakes, and then crushed them inside the trap they had willingly entered. In an era where war was dominated by instinct and fury, the Templars brought calculation, geometry, and psychological manipulation to the front line, turning the battlefield itself into their ally and transforming every charge against them into the beginning of the enemy's downfall. The third secret strategy that allowed the Templars to crush armies far larger than themselves was their mastery of layered endurance, a system that turned their bodies into weapons of precision, and their stamina into a tool of psychological domination. Most medieval armies fought with explosive intensity at the start of battle, pouring all their energy into the first minutes, hoping to achieve a breakthrough through sheer aggression. But the Templars did the opposite. They fought in controlled rhythms, deliberately alternating between bursts of power and invisible micro-pauses that allowed them to conserve energy while the enemy burned through theirs. This was not instinct, nor coincidence. It was training carved into their daily routines, transforming each knight into a master of sustained combat. When facing a much larger force, this pattern gave them an advantage that became more devastating as the minutes passed. Their daily conditioning was unlike anything practiced by other military orders. While many armies relied on physical size or brute strength, the Templars relied on endurance as a mathematical weapon. They drilled relentlessly in formations that required not only physical stamina but mental precision, teaching their bodies to move and rest as one coordinated unit. During battle, these micropauses happened in ways the enemy could not detect: a brief reduction in pressure on the shield, a controlled breath, a shift in weight that gave the muscles a moment of relief. These moments, repeated hundreds of times, accumulated into a reservoir of strength that their enemies simply could not match. By the time opposing forces were panting, sweating, and losing cohesion, the Templars still carried a calm steadiness that looked supernatural. This rhythm of endurance had a devastating psychological effect. Soldiers who believed they held the advantage at the beginning of the battle soon realized their mistake when the Templars' strength didn't fade. They watched as their own ranks began to wobble, fatigue spreading like a silent infection, while the Templars seemed to move with the same precision they had at the start. The enemy's confidence slowly decayed, replaced by dread. Nothing breaks a warrior's spirit more than seeing that his opponent is not tiring. Chroniclers from the era wrote that it felt as if the Templars grew stronger while others withered. That perception, even if exaggerated by fear, became a weapon in itself. Their endurance strategy also affected the timing of their attacks. The Templars never unleashed their most powerful strikes at the beginning of a battle. Instead, they waited for the exact moment when the enemy's strength dipped below a critical threshold. When respiration became chaotic, when shields trembled slightly, when the formation loosened by just one step, the Templars struck with a coordinated surge. This sudden shift in tempo, from controlled defense to explosive offense, shattered tired lines with frightening efficiency. The impact was both physical and emotional. The enemy felt as though the Templars had been holding back, waiting, and studying them before unveiling their true power. This endurance-based warfare required a level of discipline that bordered on the extreme. Every knight was conditioned not to overextend, not to let adrenaline dictate his pace, not to break the collective rhythm. Their minds were trained to perceive the battle not as a chaotic clash, but as a structured sequence of rising and falling intensity. It was this mental framing that allowed them to remain focused even when surrounded, even when outnumbered, even when the battle dragged on for hours. In truth, their endurance was as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. They understood that the mind collapses before the body does, and they aimed their strategy directly at the mind. By the time the enemy realized what was happening, it was too late. Their soldiers were exhausted, their formation weakened, and their morale shaken. Meanwhile, the Templars still stood steady, breathing with controlled rhythm, eyes locked forward, ready for the next surge. This was the hidden engine of their victories, a system that did not rely on numbers, intimidation, or brute force, but on mastery of time, energy, and psychological pressure. Through layered endurance, the Templars turned the length of the battle into their greatest ally, transforming every passing minute into another blade in their hands, another weight crushing their opponents, another step toward inevitable triumph. Across centuries of battles, betrayals, and kingdoms rising and falling like tides, one truth echoes through the chronicles of history: the Templars were never defined by numbers, but by mastery. Their victories were not accidents of fate but the result of a discipline so sharp it cut deeper than steel, a unity so absolute it made even the largest armies question their courage, and a strategic brilliance that turned the battlefield itself into their greatest ally. When they fought, they did not simply clash with the enemy. They reshaped the very rhythm of war. From the silence that crushed morale before the first strike to the deceptive U-formation that swallowed cavalry whole to the endurance that outlasted empires to the precise elimination of leadership, and finally to the shield well that transformed small forces into living citadels, the Templars crafted victory long before the enemy ever raised a sword. Their legacy is not carved only in stone fortresses or ancient manuscripts, but in the principles that continue to influence military strategy centuries later. They demonstrated that war is not a contest of size but of structure, that fear can be engineered, that chaos can be manipulated, and that an army that moves with one purpose can overcome forces far greater than itself. Their strategies became the silent blueprint behind modern tactics of psychological warfare, formation control, and leadership targeting. And yet, beyond the strategy, there was something deeper, a belief that discipline could transcend limitation, that unity could crush uncertainty, and that purpose could forge invincibility. This is the immortal legacy of the Templar Order, a legacy that did not die with their suppression, nor with the ashes of their Grand Master, nor with the secrecy that tried to bury their brilliance. It lives in every reenactment of their tactics, in every historian who seeks to decode their mysteries, in every battlefield where strategy still triumphs over numbers. They were more than warriors. They were architects of the impossible, and long after their enemies vanished from the pages of time, the Templars remained etched into history as the brotherhood that made kings tremble and made the world wonder how such a small order forged victories so monumental. Their story endures because it was never merely about war. It was about the human capacity to rise beyond fear, beyond limitation, and beyond the ordinary rules that bind the rest of the world. That is why their legacy is not only remembered, it is immortal. The fourth strategy that allowed the Templars to crush forces far larger than their own was a method as ruthless as it was precise: emotional decapitation. While most medieval armies fought in broad, unfocused clashes that relied on overwhelming numbers, the Templars focused their power like a blade aimed at the heart. They understood a truth that many commanders of their time never fully grasped: an army does not collapse when its soldiers fall, but when its leaders lose control. So instead of wasting strength fighting the entire opposing force head-on, the Templars targeted the psychological spine of the enemy: the generals, banner carriers, signalers, and key officers whose presence held the formation together. Once these figures fell, even the largest armies disintegrated into chaos, panic, and confusion. Templar reconnaissance played a vital role in this tactic. Before a battle, they studied enemy patterns, identifying who issued commands, who relayed signals, who inspired morale. These individuals were not chosen randomly. They were the emotional anchors of the entire army. When the Templars launched their attack, they did not rush into the mass of soldiers like a typical charge. Instead, they executed a spearhead formation designed to pierce through the front lines with terrifying speed. Their goal was not to kill the most men. It was to strike the exact men whose fall would break the morale of thousands. Chroniclers describe situations where, within minutes, Templar units had reached and eliminated the enemy commander before the main clash even unfolded. An army without leadership became a sea of frightened individuals, each fighting alone rather than as a unified force. This tactic depended heavily on precision and timing. The Templars had to advance quickly enough to break through the outer ranks, but not so recklessly that they became isolated. Their training allowed them to maneuver through tightly packed formations, using their shields like wedges to split enemy lines and create micropaths that guided them toward their target. Each knight in the spearhead formation had a specific role. Those on the flanks absorbed impact and redirected enemy pressure outward, while the central knights moved forward with unstoppable determination. This coordination created a psychological shockwave as soldiers witnessed what appeared to be a supernatural breach in their own lines. The moment the Templars reached the leadership circle, their strikes were swift and unhesitating. It was not brutality. It was strategy. Once the commander or banner carrier fell, the emotional collapse was immediate. Soldiers lost orientation. Communication lines shattered. Orders stopped flowing. Confusion spread through the battlefield like wildfire. Units that had once marched with confidence suddenly found themselves leaderless, uncertain whether to advance, retreat, or stand their ground. Many medieval soldiers fought not for victory but for loyalty to their commander. Seeing him fall drained them of purpose and courage. And while some armies had secondary leaders, the Templars struck so fast that even these backup figures were often eliminated before they could re-establish order. The battlefield turned into a fragmented chaos of isolated groups, each fighting without direction. This collapse was more devastating than any physical blow. Fear replaced discipline. Rumors spread across the ranks at lightning speed. The commander is dead. The banners have fallen. The knights in white have reached the center. These whispers eroded morale long before the Templars reached the outer edges. Large armies, which relied on cohesion, suddenly became thousands of individuals fighting without a shared goal. And while the enemy struggled to reorganize, the Templars maintained perfect structure, striking with the confidence of soldiers who knew they controlled the rhythm of the battle. Their psychological advantage grew with every passing second. What made this strategy so terrifying was its efficiency. A single well-timed breach could collapse an entire army of thousands. The Templars proved that war was not won by killing the most soldiers, but by destroying the emotional architecture that held those soldiers together. By targeting leadership with surgical precision, they turned the battlefield into a stage where even enormous armies became fragile once their center snapped. Through emotional decapitation, the Templars revealed the truth centuries ahead of its time. Victory belongs not to the largest force, but to the one that strikes where meaning, direction, and courage are born. And without those, the mightiest armies crumble like sand. The fifth and final strategy that allowed the Templars to crush armies far larger than themselves was their mastery of an impenetrable defensive system known as the Shield Wall of Faith, a formation so disciplined, so unified, and so psychologically overwhelming that it turned a small number of knights and sergeants into a living fortress. While most medieval armies relied on loose, inconsistent lines that collapsed under pressure, the Templars crafted a wall of interlocked shields and angled spears designed to absorb impact, redirect force, and break the momentum of even the largest cavalry charges. This formation was not merely physical, it was spiritual. The Templars believed they were defending something greater than survival, and that conviction gave them a steadiness no ordinary soldier could match. As enemy forces thundered toward them, the Templars did not tremble or shift. They simply locked their shields, lowered their spears, and became an unmovable whitened wall under the sun. Every detail of this formation was engineered with purpose. The front line locked their shields at overlapping angles, creating a barrier without gaps, while the second line positioned their spears outward between the shields, forming a deadly forest of steel points. Behind them, additional ranks reinforced pressure from the rear, ensuring that no man bore the impact alone. The height of the shields, the angle of the spears, the spacing between feet, nothing was left to chance. This structure distributed the shock of incoming forces across the entire formation, allowing the Templars to endure impacts that should have shattered ordinary lines. Knights who had trained for years in the art of collective resistance held their ground with calm focus, acting as pieces of a singular organism rather than individual warriors. When massive cavalry charges collided with the shield wall, the effect was catastrophic, not for the Templars, but for the enemy. Horses, unable to penetrate the barrier of shields and spears, reared up in confusion, colliding with their own ranks. Riders lost control, momentum died, and the overwhelming force of the charge dissolved into a tangle of panic and fallen bodies. Infantry faced a similar fate. Their frontal assaults struck a surface that would not break, bending their weapons and draining their morale. The harder the enemy pushed, the stronger the Templars seemed to stand. Each failed assault amplified fear. The enemy realized they were not fighting a line of men, they were fighting something that felt unbreakable. Something engineered to withstand storms of steel. But the brilliance of the shield wall came not only from its defensive strength, it came from what followed. Once the enemy's momentum was broken and their formation destabilized, the Templars transitioned into a sudden, explosive counterattack. This shift from a movable defense to roaring offense hit the enemy with the force of a trap snapping shut. As the first line opened, small, calculated gaps, units from behind surged forward, striking with precision against disoriented enemies who had just exhausted themselves trying to break the wall. The psychological shock of this reversal was devastating. Soldiers who moments earlier believed victory was certain now found themselves collapsing under a counterstrike they never saw coming. The shield wall also served as a psychological anchor for the Templars themselves. Knowing they had a formation capable of withstanding overwhelming force filled them with quiet confidence, allowing them to fight without fear. This emotional stability contrasted sharply with the enemy's rising desperation. As the battle dragged on, fatigue gnawed at opposing soldiers, while the Templars maintained their composure and rhythm. The shield wall protected their bodies, but the discipline behind it protected their minds. And when an army loses its mental footing, defeat becomes inevitable. Ultimately, the shield wall of faith was more than a military tactic. It was a manifestation of the Templars' identity, precise, unified, fearless, and unshakable. It turned every battlefield into a stage where numbers lost meaning and willpower became the true currency of survival. When the enemy saw that their strongest charges broke against an unmovable wall, something inside them cracked. That crack spread, widened, and finally shattered into collapse. Through this final strategy, the Templars proved one of the oldest truths of war. The mightiest army is not the one with the most soldiers, but the one that cannot be broken. Not by force, not by fear, not by anything that rides against it. If this journey into the hidden power of the Templar Order inspired you, then take a moment to strengthen this brotherhood we're building here. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notifications so you never miss the next chapter of medieval mysteries and elite strategies. Share this video with someone who loves history, and comment below which Templar secret shocked you the most. Your voice helps expand this community and keeps these forgotten stories alive.